The tires crunched over the frost-heaved pavement of my hometown, a sound I associated with winter coats and early sunsets. But inside the rental car, the air was heavy, humid with the specific heat Nora always seemed to generate. Her hand rested high on my thigh, her thumb tracing a slow, deliberate circle against the denim. It wasn't a nervous gesture. It was a claim. My parents knew she was coming. They knew about us. But worse, they knew about her. The magazine covers, the gallery openings, the way she refused to dim her light for anyone. This wasn't just a visit. It was a collision. The gravel of the driveway popped under the tires like a warning shot, signaling the end of the safe world. The house loomed against the gray sky, a structure designed for people who kept their voices low and their lawns manicured to the millimeter. It was a place of walls built of glass and expectation, where visibility was high, but transparency was non-existent. I killed the engine. The silence rushed in, threatening to suffocate me before I even unbuckled. Nora didn't wait. She opened her door and stepped out into the biting wind, her coat a slash of crimson wool against the beige siding of the garage. It was too loud, too structured, too vivid for this zip code. That was the point. She adjusted her sunglasses, though the sun hadn't been seen in days, and offered me a smile that was all sharp edges and soft promise. "Ready, Madison?" she asked, her voice a low hum that vibrated in my chest. I wasn't. I never was. But I nodded, grabbing my bag. We walked to the front door, the sound of our boots out of sync, my sensible tread against the sharp, rhythmic click of her heels. The door opened before we knocked. My mother, Chloe, stood there. She looked exactly as I remembered, polished, contained, every hair sprayed into submission. She wore a sweater the color of oatmeal and an expression that suggested she smelled something faintly unpleasant. "Madison," she said, offering a cheek that felt like cool marble. "You're late." "Traffic?" I lied. I stepped back, pulling Nora forward. "Mom, this is Nora." The air in the foyer stopped moving. Chloe didn't extend a hand immediately. Instead, her gaze traveled down Nora's figure with the clinical precision of a radiologist looking for a fracture. She took in the crimson coat, the leather gloves, the way Nora stood with her weight on one hip, unapologetic and taking up space. "Nora!" Chloe said finally. The name sounded foreign in her mouth, like a spice she didn't know how to use. "We've heard so much. It's lovely to meet you, Chloe," Nora said. She didn't hesitate. She stepped fully into the foyer, bringing the scent of sandalwood and expensive skincare with her, overpowering the house's permanent smell of lemon polish and suppression. She extended her hand, forcing my mother to take it. "Madison talks about the garden constantly." It was a lie, but a graceful one. My mother released Nora's hand, quickly, as if the heat might transfer. "It's dormant now. Winter." She turned her back to us, her posture rigid. "Come in. Your father is in the living room." Stepping across the threshold usually made me feel 12 years old again. Clumsy, loud, wrong. The foyer was a vacuum that sucked the confidence right out of my marrow. I felt my shoulders hunch, an automatic defense mechanism developed over 2 decades of critiques disguised as advice. But then I felt it. Nora's hand found the small of my back. It wasn't a shove, it was an anchor. Her fingers spread wide, the heat of her palm burning through my sweater. She pressed firmly, a silent reminder that I wasn't that 12-year-old girl anymore. I was the woman who loved this woman. I was the person who navigated boardrooms and city streets and Nora's complex, fiery heart. I straightened my spine. The sensory shift was violent as we moved from the chilly, sterile foyer into the living room. The heat was cranked up too high, a stifling artificial warmth meant to compensate for the emotional frost. The walls were lined with photos of me, graduation, piano recitals, all capturing a version of Madison that smiled with her mouth shut. "Coat," I whispered to Nora. She shrugged it off, revealing a silk blouse that clung in all the right places, tasteful but undeniably sensual. My mother's eyes narrowed as she hung the crimson wool in the closet, burying it between the gray and navy parkas. It looked like a heart beating in a morgue. "Drink?" Chloe asked, not looking at us. "Whiskey," Nora said. "Neat." I almost laughed. The architecture of silence was already cracking under the weight of Nora's refusal to play the role of the demure guest. My father, Robert, occupied the wing-back chair like a piece of rented furniture he was afraid to damage. He held a newspaper, though I hadn't seen him turn a page in the 3 minutes we'd been standing there. When we entered, he folded it with agonizing slowness, rising to offer a hand that felt like dry paper. "Nora," he said, his voice a soft rustle. "Welcome." He looked at me, then quickly away, as if my sudden proximity to someone like Nora might be contagious. He retreated behind his glass of iced tea immediately, the ice clinking, a lonely, erratic sound in the quiet room. We sat, or rather, Chloe indicated where we should sit, and we complied. The sofa was stiff, the kind of furniture bought for appearance rather than comfort. Nora sat beside me, but not with me. She sat with a terrifying ease, crossing her legs, the silk of her blouse catching the dull lamplight. She didn't adjust her skirt. She didn't fidget. She took a sip of the whiskey my mother had reluctantly poured, the amber liquid looking violent against the pale coasters. "The weather held up," Chloe said, settling into the opposing armchair. "We were worried about ice." "The roads were fine," I said. My voice sounded thin, reedy. "Just a bit of wind." "And the city?" Chloe asked, though she was looking at Nora's shoes. "Busy, I assume." "Vibrant," Nora corrected. She swirled her glass. "It keeps you awake." The small talk died a quick, gasping death. Chloe leaned forward. On the coffee table, between a bowl of decorative, scentless pine cones and a coaster stack, lay a neat pile of papers. Not a magazine. Printouts. The edges were aligned with a ruler's precision. My stomach turned over, a slow, sick rotation. "We didn't want to be unprepared," Chloe said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming confidential, almost conspiratorial. "We wanted to understand your work, Nora. Madison is often so vague about the details." She reached out and tapped the top sheet. I could see the image upside down, but I knew it instantly. It was from the Raw exhibit in Berlin last autumn. Nora, shot in high-contrast black and white, her back arched, her face turned toward the camera with an expression of devastating, wrecked ecstasy. It was a beautiful photograph. Here on my parents' oak coffee table next to the Reader's Digest, it looked like a crime scene photo. I saw the timestamp in the corner of the page. 2:14 a.m. My mother had been up in the dead of night, scouring search engines, printing evidence of my partner's existence like she was building a case for the prosecution. "I must say," Chloe continued, her eyes locking onto Nora's, "it's quite bold to have this accessible to anyone with an internet connection." The implication hung there, heavy and toxic. She wasn't asking about the art. She was stating that Nora was public property, that she was damaged goods, that she was a scandal waiting to spill onto their beige carpet. I felt the heat rush to my face, the old shame, the feeling that I had brought something dirty into a clean place. "It's not just accessible, Chloe," Nora said. Her voice didn't waver. She didn't glance at me for reassurance. She didn't need it. She set her glass down with a deliberate clack. "It was the centerpiece of the gallery. It sold for more than this house is worth on the opening night." My father coughed, a sudden, sharp sound, and hid behind his tea. Chloe blinked. The financial precision threw her, but only for a second. Money doesn't always equate to propriety. I worry about the exposure, for you, and for those associated with you. Vulnerability isn't exposure, Nora said, her tone smooth, educational, as if explaining a complex concept to a slow student. It's leverage. I control what the world sees. I control the angle, the light, and the price. There is nothing exposed about me that I haven't authorized. She leaned forward, mirroring my mother's posture, invading the demilitarized zone of the coffee table. I don't hide, Chloe. I find that hiding is usually where the rot sets in. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was charged, vibrating with the static of a direct hit. Chloe looked at the printouts, then at Nora, realizing her dossier had just been dismissed as irrelevant, Dinner, my father said suddenly, standing up as if ejected from his chair. Dinner should be ready. The dining room was a study in aggressive neutrality. The table was set with the good china, white with a thin, severe gold rim, and the silverware was aligned with a geometric rigor that suggested a surgeon had laid it out rather than a mother. We took our seats. The arrangement was deliberate, a tribunal setup, my parents on one side, flanking the roast chicken-like judges, and Nora and I on the other, the accused. The air in the room was brittle, cooled by the draft from the bay window and the emotional permafrost radiating from Chloe. She began to carve the bird with sharp, efficient strokes, the knife clicking against the platter in a rhythm that sounded like a ticking clock. So, my father said, clearing his throat and looking desperately at the centerpiece. The zoning board is finally voting on the park expansion next week. Is that so? Nora asked. Her voice was warm, interested, a stark contrast to the sterile atmosphere. Do you think it will pass? Hard to say, he mumbled, grateful for the lifeline. The noise ordinance is the sticking point. That was when the world split in two. Above the mahogany surface, everything was polite, precise, and suffocatingly normal. We passed the green beans. We poured the water. We nodded at the appropriate intervals regarding the noise ordinance. But below the heavy tablecloth, a different conversation began. Nora's hand dropped from the table. It didn't retreat to her lap. It drifted sideways, finding my knee in the darkness. Her palm was hot, a sudden brand against the cool slide of my stockings. I stiffened, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth. I glanced at her, but she was looking at my father, her expression one of polite engagement, her head tilted just so. It's always a balance, Nora said smoothly, between preservation and progress. As she spoke the word progress, her hand slid upward. It wasn't a tentative touch. It was slow, heavy, and deliberate. Her thumb traced the line of my inner thigh, pressing firmly into the muscle, claiming the territory. The sensation was electric, a jolt of raw, unpolished want that short-circuited my ability to swallow. I set my fork down, the clatter too loud in the quiet room. Chloe looked up sharply. Is something wrong with the chicken, Madison? No, I managed, my voice sounding strangled. I reached for my water glass, my hand trembling slightly. It's dry. Delicious. Just need water. It's a balance, Nora repeated, turning her gaze to Chloe. Her eyes were dark, amused, knowing. Beneath the table, her fingers dangerously skirted the hem of my dress, the friction of her skin against the nylon sending a shiver straight up my spine. You have to know what you're willing to sacrifice to get the environment you want. The double meaning hung in the air, thick and sultry. She wasn't talking about the park. She was talking about us. She was talking about the sacrifice of their comfort for our reality. I felt a flush rise from my chest to my neck, a betrayal of my body that I couldn't suppress. The contrast was maddening. My mother was talking about the neighbor's hedges, her voice a flat line of judgment, while inches away, hidden by the table, Nora was dismantling my composure with a terrifying precision. Her touch was a secret language, a silent rebellion, right there in the enemy's camp. It said, I am here. You are mine. They cannot touch us. I imagine, Chloe said, eyeing the flush on my neck with suspicion, that in your line of work, Nora, boundaries are often fluid. Nora's hand stopped. She didn't withdraw. She gripped my thigh, hard, a squeeze that was almost painful, grounding me, holding me in the tension. She smiled at my mother, a smile that didn't show teeth but showed everything else. Definitions are essential, Chloe, Nora said, her voice dropping to that low, resonant register that usually happened only in the dark of our bedroom. But they should be choices you make, not scripts other people hand you. She squeezed once more, a final possessive punctuation mark, before slowly, agonizingly withdrawing her hand. The absence of her touch was colder than the room itself. I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and picked up my fork again. The metal felt foreign in my hand, a tool from a world I no longer lived in. I was no longer just the daughter at the table. I was the woman who had just been claimed, silently and completely, while discussing municipal zoning laws. The dinner continued, but the balance of power had shifted. The table was no longer a barrier. It was a veil, and we were the only ones who knew what lay behind it. The silence, following the retreat of Nora's hand, was heavy, a vacuum that my mother rushed to fill. She wiped her mouth with her linen napkin, a precise, erasing motion, as if scrubbing away the uncomfortable subtext of the last 5 minutes. The zoning board was forgotten. The roast chicken was irrelevant. Chloe pivoted, her eyes locking onto me with the terrifying focus of an auditor finding a discrepancy in the ledger. "It is not just the art, is it?" she began, her voice dropping into a register of concern that I knew was merely a velvet sheath for a dagger. "I wonder, Madison, how the partners at your firm view this specific brand of visibility." She didn't wait for an answer. She leaned back, crossing her arms, the fabric of her oatmeal sweater rustling in the quiet room. "You've worked so hard for that corner office. The culture there is traditional, conservative. I worry that being associated with someone who lives so loudly might be a liability. Is this kind of attention wise for someone in your position?" The critique was surgical. It bypassed the relationship entirely and targeted my deepest insecurity, the fear that my two worlds, the sterile, high-stakes boardroom and the vibrant, messy reality of loving Nora, were fundamentally incompatible. I opened my mouth to recite the company's diversity policy, a weak shield against her implication, but Nora spoke first. "Madison's standing is built on her competence, Chloe, not her proximity to silence," Nora said. Her voice was low, smooth, a cello note in a room full of breaking glass. She didn't look angry. She looked bored by the premise. "If her firm cannot distinguish between her strategic brilliance and my public existence, then they are the liability, not me. Logic dictates you don't devalue an asset because of who she sleeps with." It was a dismantling, sophisticated, and cool. But Chloe wasn't deterred by logic. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan, a movement that felt premeditated, and produced a folded slip of newsprint. It wasn't a fresh printout. It was older, the edges soft and gray. She unfolded it and placed it on the white tablecloth next to the gravy boat. "Logic is fine, Nora," Chloe said, her voice tightening, "but headlines are louder. The Muse of Mayhem. That is what they called you in London after the hotel incident, wasn't it?" The image was grainy, a paparazzi shot of Nora outside a hotel looking disheveled, her mascara smeared, her mouth open in a shout that looked like rage. To the world and to my mother, it was a snapshot of an artist, spiraling out of control. "Is this the dignity of a partner's spouse?" Chloe asked, tapping the paper with a manicured nail. "A woman who gets thrown out of hotels at 3 a.m. I looked at the photo. I remembered that night. I remembered the phone call at 3:05 a.m. It wasn't a party. It wasn't a spiral. It was the night Nora had found out her funding was pulled because she refused to censor a queer exhibit. The shout was her screaming at a curator who had called her work perverse. I looked at Nora. For the first time, her perfect composure slipped. A tiny fracture appeared in her expression. Not shame, but a deep, exhausted weariness. She looked at the clipping as if it were a physical weight she was too tired to carry. Something in my chest tore open. It wasn't embarrassment. It was a fierce, hot surge of protective instinct. I didn't see a scandal. I saw the vulnerability behind the armor, the cost of living authentically in a world that wanted to consume her. "That wasn't mayhem," I said, my voice shaking, cutting through the tension. "That was integrity. And I would rather be associated with that mess than with this polite silence." The table went dead still. The air stretched tight, a wire ready to snap. "I think," Nora said, standing abruptly, her chair scraping a harsh, discordant screech against the floorboards, "I am done with this meal." The silence in the dining room wasn't peaceful. It was the breathless quiet of a crater after impact. Nora remained standing, her silhouette sharp against the heavy damask drapes, a crimson warning sign my father was too terrified to read. He sat frozen, clutching his linen napkin like a surrender flag, staring into his water glass as if hoping to drown there. Chloe didn't look back at the wreckage she had caused. She gathered the dinner plates with a violent, clattering efficiency that threatened to chip the china and marched toward the kitchen. The swinging door swallowed her whole, oscillating wildly in her wake. I didn't look at Nora. I couldn't. If I looked at her now, I would lose the nerve to do what came next. I needed to finish this where it started. I pushed back my chair, the sound harsh against the hardwood, and followed my mother. The kitchen was a different kind of assault. The overhead fluorescence hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, casting a clinical, unforgiving glare on the pristine linoleum. It smelled of lemon detergent and old resentment, the specific chemical scent of every lecture I'd ever received about my posture, my grades, and my choices. It was a space designed for correction. Chloe stood at the sink, her back to me, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. The water ran hot, steam rising around her like a barrier. She was attacking the porcelain, her shoulders high and tight, vibrating with the energy of a woman who believes she is the only thing standing between order and chaos. "She is too much, Madison," Chloe said, not turning around. Her voice was tight, squeezed from a throat constricted by propriety. "She is a spectacle. You bring her here, into this house, and she practically dares us to look away." "She's not daring you," I said, leaning my hip against the cool granite counter to stop my hands from shaking. "She's just existing. Why does that feel like an attack to you?" Chloe turned off the tap. The silence that rushed in was heavy and wet. She turned to face me, her hands dripping soapy water, stripping away the polished hostess veneer she wore in the living room. Under the harsh lights, she looked older, frightened. "Because life is hard enough without inviting the lightning to strike you," she snapped, wiping her hands on a towel with frantic precision. "You have built a good life, a safe life. You need someone steady, someone who smooths the edges, not someone who sharpens them. You need peace, Madison, not this." She gestured vaguely toward the dining room, as if Nora were a natural disaster that had just rolled through the suburbs. "I don't want peace if it means silence," I said. The words tasted like metal, foreign but necessary. I spent 20 years being steady. I spent 20 years smoothing every edge until I almost disappeared. Nora doesn't sharpen the edges, Mom. She just refuses to pretend they aren't there. "It's an obsession," Chloe whispered, the accusation landing softly but with the weight of a stone. "I see how you watch her. You look at her like you're starving. It's not healthy. It's volatile. It will cost you everything." I felt a strange calm settle over me. She was right about the hunger, but wrong about the danger. She saw the heat and assumed it was destruction. She didn't understand that for the first time in my life, I wasn't cold. "It's not an obsession," I said, my voice dropping, finding that precise, authoritative register I used in boardrooms, a tone she had never heard in this kitchen. "It's oxygen. What you call a spectacle, I call courage." She walks into a room and refuses to diminish herself. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to constantly apologize for your own existence? She stopped doing that years ago, and being near her, it makes me want to stop too. Chloe stared at me. The water dripped from her hands onto the pristine floor, a small, messy imperfection she would usually rush to wipe up. But she didn't move. She saw it then, the stranger standing in her daughter's body. "You're choosing a hard road," she said finally, her voice devoid of anger, left only with a hollow disappointment. "I'm choosing my own road," I corrected. "And I'm not walking it alone." I turned and walked out. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally cutting the wire. The kitchen felt small behind me, a shrinking box I could no longer fit inside. I needed the air, I needed the heat, I needed the anchor of Nora's presence to stop the trembling. I climbed the stairs, the carpet muffling my footsteps, each riser a physical regression into a past I had outgrown. My childhood bedroom waited at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. Stepping inside was like walking into a museum exhibit curated by a stranger. The walls were still a suffocating pastel yellow, a color chosen for a girl who practiced scales for 3 hours a day and never raised her voice. The corkboard was a mosaic of second-place ribbons and dried corsages, a shrine to a version of Madison who smiled when she was told to and folded her hands in her lap. It was a time capsule of obedience, preserved in dust and lavender sachets. And then there was Nora. She stood by the single window, her crimson coat discarded on the desk chair, her silhouette cutting a sharp, vibrant hole in the room's faded innocence. She looked entirely too large for the space. Her presence here, among the stuffed animals and the high school yearbooks, felt illicit, a violation of the room's mandated chastity. She was a panther, pacing in a dollhouse. I closed the door. The latch clicked, a small, definitive sound that severed the connection to the kitchen, the dining room, and the judgment waiting downstairs. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, immediate, and safe. The professional armor I wore for my mother, the dutiful daughter role I played for my father. They both fell away the moment the wood met the frame. My shoulders dropped. The trembling in my hands, which I had hidden in the kitchen, returned with a vengeance. I didn't have to hide it here. Not from her. Nora didn't ask if I was okay. She knew better. She didn't offer empty platitudes about how they meant well. She simply crossed the room in 2 strides, closing the distance with a terrifying grace. She didn't hug me. She anchored me. She pulled me into her, her arms locking around my waist, her weight settling against mine with a solidity that made the floorboards stop spinning. It was a comfort born of proximity, not pity. She held me tight enough to bruise, grounding me in the physical reality of her body, reminding me that I was flesh and blood, not just a disappointment in a silk blouse. "I hate this," she murmured, her voice vibrating against my collarbone. "I hate what this place does to you. It makes you small. You are not small, Madison." I buried my face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her, smoke and expensive perfume, and the underlying salty warmth of her skin. It was the smell of my real life. "I'm fine," I lied, the words muffled against her shoulder. "You're shaking," she noted, pulling back just enough to look at me. Her eyes were dark, searching, stripped of the public arrogance she wore like armor. For the first time all night, I saw the crack in her own facade. It's not the judgment that bothers me, you know. I can handle being the villain in their story. I'm used to it. She hesitated, her thumb grazing the line of my jaw, a touch so tender it made my chest ache. "I hate that I'm the reason you're shaking. I hate that my existence makes your life harder. I look at you in this room with these ribbons, and I feel like a sledgehammer taking down a load-bearing wall. I don't want to be the thing that breaks you." "You aren't breaking me," I whispered, covering her hand with mine, pressing her palm harder against my face. "You're the only thing holding me together. They built this room to keep me quiet. You're the reason I finally have a voice." We moved to the bed, the narrow, twin-sized mattress that had held my adolescent dreams of escape. We sat on the edge, the springs protesting under our combined weight. The space was absurdly small, forcing us into a tangle of limbs, a forced intimacy that felt urgent and necessary. Nora leaned back against the headboard, pulling me down with her. There was no sex, but the air was charged with a sultry, heavy heat that felt more intimate than any physical act. It was the intimacy of skin without barriers. I kicked off my shoes and curled into her side, my head on her chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic thrum of her heart. Her hand moved under my shirt to rest on the bare skin of my waist, her fingers splaying wide, claiming the territory. Her touch was hot, possessive, burning away the lingering chill of my mother's kitchen. We lay there in the dim light, the pastel walls closing in, but they didn't matter anymore. We had created a pocket of reality in the center of the fiction. The room smelled of her now. The silence was ours. I closed my eyes, focusing on the precision of her breathing, the rise and fall of her chest, the way her leg hooked over mine, heavy and permanent. Then the sound came. A soft, hesitant knock on the door. It wasn't the sharp rap of authority. It was tentative, almost apologetic. But in the sanctuary we had built, it sounded like a gunshot. Nora stiffened beneath me. The world was trying to get back in. The knock was soft, but in the charged silence of the room it landed like a gavel. Nora stiffened beneath me, her hand pausing on my waist. The world outside, the world of zoning boards, beige carpets, and silent judgments, was demanding re-entry. I pulled away from Nora, not because I wanted to, but because I knew the sanctuary had been breached. I smoothed my hair, a reflex I hated, and stood up just as the door creaked open. Chloe stood in the hallway light, a silhouette framed by the harsh, artificial glow of the landing. She held a stack of folded towels against her chest, like a shield, a domestic prop designed to justify the intrusion. She didn't step inside immediately. She hovered on the threshold, her eyes adjusting to the dimness of the bedroom, darting from the unmade bed to Nora, who had shifted to sit on the edge of the mattress, legs crossed, her expression unreadable in the shadows. "I thought you might need these," Chloe said, her voice tight, lacking its usual polished cadence. "The guest bathroom? The heater is finicky. I didn't want you to be cold." "We're not cold," I said. The truth of it hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Chloe stepped into the room then, ignoring the boundary. She placed the towels on the dresser, her movements stiff. She didn't leave. She turned to me, her back to Nora, creating a small conspiratorial circle that excluded the woman sitting on the bed. She lowered her voice, dropping into that register of maternal concern that always preceded a critique. "Madison," she began, her hands clasping together in front of her oatmeal sweater, "I know you think I am being difficult, but I am your mother. It is my job to see the things you are too enamored to see." "What things, Mom?" I asked, crossing my arms. I felt a strange steadiness in my legs, a grounding that hadn't been there an hour ago. "The instability," Chloe whispered, glancing over her shoulder at Nora as if she were a volatile chemical that might explode if looked at too directly. "People like that, they burn bright, yes, they are exciting, but they leave ash behind. They consume the oxygen in the room. I don't want you to wake up in 10 years and realize you burned down your reputation for a moment of rebellion." The word hung there. Rebellion. As if my life, my love, my choice was nothing more than a teenager acting out against a curfew. Nora didn't speak. She didn't defend herself. She sat perfectly still, a dark shape against the pale sheets, letting the accusation land. She was waiting for me. She was letting me choose. I didn't look at the towels. I didn't look at the floor. I took a single, deliberate step to the side, placing my body directly in the line of sight between my mother and Nora. It was a physical eclipse. I blocked the view. I broke the line of judgment. "She isn't the fire, Mom," I said, my voice low but vibrating with a new, terrifying precision. "She's the hearth. You are confusing passion with destruction because you have never allowed yourself to feel the first one." Chloe flinched, her eyes widening. She wasn't used to resistance. She was used to evasion. "I am done apologizing for the space she takes up," I continued, the words flowing with an authority I usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations. "You don't have to understand her art. You don't have to like her politics or the volume of her voice, but you must respect my choice. This isn't a negotiation. It isn't a phase you wait out in the guest room while you make polite conversation about the weather." I took a breath, inhaling the stale air of my childhood, and exhaling the woman I had become. "If you insult her again," I said, locking eyes with her, refusing to blink, "if you try to make her feel small in this house, you won't just lose a guest. You will lose me. I will get in that car tonight, and I will not come back for Christmas. I will not come back for birthdays. I will be gone, and I will take my life, my real life, with me." The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the polite, suffocating silence of the dinner table. It was the heavy, shifting silence of a load-bearing wall being removed. The power dynamic in the room tilted, sliding away from the mother who knew best, and settling firmly at the feet of the daughter who knew herself. Chloe looked at me. She really looked at me, searching for the 12-year-old girl who cried when she spilled milk, the girl who sought approval like sunlight. She didn't find her. She found a stranger with my face, standing guard over the woman she loved. "I see," Chloe said softly. Her voice was thin, stripped of its command. Her hands tightened on her own arms, a self-soothing gesture I had never seen her use. I see." She didn't apologize. That wasn't in the architecture of her world, but she nodded. A small, stiff jerk of the chin. It was a concession. It was the white flag. She turned slowly, her movements looking suddenly older, heavier. She walked to the door, pausing for a fraction of a second as if to add a postscript but thinking better of it. She stepped into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind her. The click of the latch was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a seal breaking. It sounded like the first breath of air after being underwater for 20 years. I stood there, staring at the wood grain, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, realizing that the house hadn't fallen down. I had drawn a line in the sand, and the tide had turned. The morning light in my parents' house was always an interrogation. It didn't filter in. It struck, bouncing off the high-gloss countertops and the polished silverware with an unforgiving brightness that made it impossible to hide the fatigue under your eyes. When I walked into the kitchen, the air was different. The heavy, suffocating humidity of the previous night's confrontation had evaporated, replaced by a dry, brittle clarity. The cracks in the family facade were no longer hairline fractures hidden by wallpaper. They were gaping fissures, visible to the naked eye, and for the first time, no one was rushing to spackle them over. Chloe was at the stove. She moved with a mechanical, jerky rhythm, flipping pancakes with a grim determination that suggested she was cooking for a wake rather than a Sunday breakfast. She didn't turn when we entered. Her posture was rigid, her spine a steel rod of defiance, but the aggressive energy was gone. She looked tired. The hostess veneer had slipped, revealing the confused mother beneath, a woman who had drawn a line in the sand and watched her daughter step right over it. "Coffee is brewed," she said to the window. Her voice was flat, stripped of the chirpy, passive-aggressive cadence she usually employed to control the mood. It wasn't warm, but it was polite. It was the tone of a treaty being honored solely to prevent further casualties. Nora walked in behind me. She was wearing one of my old flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, open over a black tank top. In any other timeline, this visual, the casual, borrowed intimacy of the clothing, would have triggered a 20-minute monologue from Chloe about proper attire at the table. Today, Chloe just glanced at the flannel, her eyes lingering on the way the fabric draped over Nora's frame, and turned back to the bacon. She didn't like it, but she didn't say a word. The boundary I had set the night before was holding, invisible but impenetrable, humming like an electric fence. We sat. The table was set, but the geometry had changed. The tribunal feeling was gone, replaced by a cautious, tentative observation. My father, Robert, sat behind his newspaper, but the barrier was lower today. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. When Nora sat down, the silence stretched, thin and taut. Then, Robert lowered the paper. He looked at Nora. He didn't look at me for permission. He didn't look at Chloe for approval. He reached out his hand, a hand I had always associated with passivity and ink stains, and picked up the silver coffee carafe. "Black, isn't it?" he asked. His voice was rusty, unused, but steady. Nora looked up, surprised. "Yes," she said, her voice dropping to that respectful, soft register she saved for people she deemed worthy. "Thank you, Robert." He poured the coffee. He did it with a strange, deliberate care, ensuring not a single drop marred the white tablecloth. He pushed the mug toward her. It was a small movement, a slide of ceramic across wood, but in the context of this house, it was a seismic shift. It was an offering. It was my father, a man who had spent 30 years deferring to the loudest voice in the room, making his own quiet peace with the stranger at his table. Chloe watched the exchange. I saw the muscle in her jaw work, a physical manifestation of the restraint she was exercising. She set a platter of eggs on the table, the china clinking loudly in the quiet. She looked at Nora then. It wasn't a look of affection. It wasn't acceptance. But as she took in Nora's calm posture, the way she accepted the coffee without triumph or apology, I saw something else flicker in my mother's eyes. It was a grudging, reluctant respect. She recognized the steel in Nora because it was the same steel she carried in her own spine. She didn't like the opponent, but she respected the fight. Nora took a sip of the coffee, her eyes meeting mine over the rim of the mug. Then she moved. She didn't retreat. She shifted closer to me. Her hand came up, not hidden under the table this time, but openly, brazenly. She placed her palm flat against the center of my back, her fingers spreading wide against the flannel. The heat of her hand burned through the layers of cotton, a branding iron of ownership. She rubbed a slow, comforting circle between my shoulder blades. It was a claim. It was a statement. I am here. I am touching her. I am not leaving. I took a bite of dry toast. It tasted like ash and victory. The house was still standing. The walls were still glass. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of them shattering. I leaned back into Nora's hand, letting the warmth anchor me, and watched the morning light illuminate the wreckage of the old rules, realizing that the destruction was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The trunk slammed shut with a definitive, heavy thud that echoed off the garage door. It was the sound of a book closing, a chapter ending, not with a cliffhanger, but with a period. We pulled out of the driveway, the gravel popping under the tires one last time. On Friday, that sound had felt like a warning shot, a prelude to a battle I wasn't sure I could win. Today, as the house receded into the gray distance, it sounded like applause. The car merged onto the interstate, leaving the manicured lawns and the architecture of silence behind in the rearview mirror. The atmosphere inside the vehicle had shifted tectonically. On the drive up, the air had been thick with dread, a humidity of unsaid things and looming conflict that made it hard to breathe. Now the air was light, crisp, charged with the specific heady electricity of survival. It was the feeling of walking away from a crash site with only bruises, the adrenaline fading into a steady, rhythmic calm. Nora drove. She kept one hand on the wheel, driving with a relaxed, terrifying competence, weaving through the Sunday traffic with a fluidity that made the other cars look static. I watched her profile against the gray winter sky rushing past the window. She looked tired. There were shadows under her eyes that the expensive concealer couldn't quite hide, and a tension in her jaw that hadn't fully released. But she didn't look diminished. If anything, the weekend had sharpened her. It wasn't a fairy tale, I said, breaking the comfortable silence. Mom didn't hug you. Dad didn't ask for a signed print. It wasn't the ending I used to dream about. Nora laughed, a low, throaty sound that vibrated in the small space of the cabin. She reached over, her hand finding the back of my neck, her thumb brushing the pulse point there. I don't need a fairy tale, Madison. I need reality. And the reality is, we walked in, we stated our terms, and we walked out without setting anything on fire. That is a victory. I leaned into her touch, closing my eyes for a second. She was right. It wasn't the tearful reconciliation movies promised. It was a truce, a hard-won, gritty territory of mutual respect carved out of a minefield. The cut of the visit, the sharp words in the kitchen, the coldness of the foyer, the violation of the dossier, had already begun to knit together. It wasn't an open wound anymore. It was healing into a scar. And scars, I realized, were just skin that had learned how to be tougher. You walked through fire for me, I said quietly, looking at her hand on my neck. The dossier, the judgment. You sat there and let them dissect you like a specimen. You didn't have to do that. Nora glanced at me, her eyes dark and serious for a moment, the humor vanishing. I would burn that house down for you, Madison. Walking through a little suburban frost is nothing compared to what I would do to keep you. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. In the kitchen, Chloe had called my feelings an obsession. She had warned me that Nora was a volatile force, that would consume the oxygen in the room. She was wrong. This wasn't volatility. It was gravity. It was the profound, stabilizing force of being loved by someone who refused to flinch. My obsession wasn't a weakness. It was the smartest investment I had ever made. The landscape outside changed. The trees and fields gave way to concrete barriers and industrial parks. And then, rising out of the gray haze like a promise, the city skyline appeared. It was jagged, messy, and beautiful, a chaotic collection of steel and light that felt like oxygen. "Look," I said, pointing toward the distant horizon. "Home," Nora said simply. The single word settled in my chest. We weren't just going back to an apartment. We were returning to the world where we made the rules. The key turned in the lock of our apartment, a sound that felt less like opening a door and more like exhaling held breath. We stepped inside. The air here was different. It smelled of espresso beans, old books, and the lingering faint scent of Nora's perfume that had settled into the throw pillows. It was the smell of a life we had curated, not one we had inherited. Nora dropped her keys in the ceramic bowl. The sound was sharp, definitive. She kicked off her boots, leaving them in the middle of the hallway, a chaotic, beautiful act of rebellion against the geometric precision we had just left behind. She didn't have to edit herself here. She didn't have to act like a guest in her own life. I watched her move into the living room, turning on the lamps that cast warm, yellow pools of light against the exposed brick. The contrast was visceral. Back there, in the house of silence and expectation, I had felt like a child playing dress-up in a woman's suit. Here, standing on the hardwood floors we paid for, I felt the weight of the weekend settle into something manageable. My mother's voice still echoed in my head. She is a spectacle. But looking at Nora now, stretching her arms above her head, the flannel shirt riding up to reveal the skin of her waist, I realized the truth. A spectacle is only a threat if you are afraid to look. I wasn't afraid anymore. The parents knew. The dossier was out on the table. The secrets were all blown. And the sky hadn't fallen. The world had just gotten larger to accommodate the truth. It turns out the walls weren't load-bearing after all. They were just plywood and fear. I crossed the room. The floorboards didn't creak with judgment. The shadows didn't hide critiques. I didn't wait for her to anchor me this time. I walked right up to her, invading her space with a possessiveness I had learned from her. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her back against my chest. She leaned into me instantly, a reflex, her head falling back onto my shoulder. "We survived," she whispered, her hands covering mine. "We didn't just survive," I said, pressing a kiss to the pulse point below her ear. "We arrived." The fear that had lived in my gut for years, the fear of the collision between my two worlds, was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty. They knew about us now, but more importantly, I knew about me. I was done defending the architecture of my happiness to people who had never bothered to build their own. I knew that I would choose this heat, this mess, this loud, unapologetic love over their silent safety every single time. The proximity wasn't forbidden here. It was the foundation. The parents' knowing wasn't the problem. It was my own hesitation to own what they knew. That hesitation was gone, left somewhere on the interstate between their driveway and our skyline. Nora moved to the window, watching the city traffic below, her silhouette framed by the lights of 1,000 other lives. She was a piece of art I finally got to keep. The visit hadn't fixed everything, but it had broken the lock on the cage. I wasn't hiding anymore. If you have ever had to stand between the person you love and the people who raised you, subscribe. Tell me in the comments, what boundary did you finally have to set?